On this beautiful day. I think summer has arrived. I am so excited. Hello, Nick. How are you?
You know, Emma, I'm all fired up, ready for action. I'm going to be as high voltage as I can possibly be to be as entertaining as possible, whilst imparting lots of useful information to help people with their stamp duty issues.
Fantastic. We love that. We love that. So if anyone missed, I interviewed Nick a couple of weeks ago. So Nick Garner, who is an incredible person to talk to if you want to reclaim your stamp duty. And that can be a really hefty chunk of money when purchasing a property. So it's really, really key that we start to understand this. So what we did in the interview a couple of weeks ago, so do go and have a look if you haven't listened already, is we went really deep dived into all of the knowledge behind stamp duty and how you can potentially claim it back or pay less. And what we're going to do today is actually put that into practice. So we're going to be looking at properties, we're going to be looking at pictures, and we're going to be able to start ourselves learning how we can start spotting things that may enable us to have some reduction on the stamp duty. So Nick, just a quick one for anyone new who didn't listen a couple of weeks ago. Please introduce yourself to anyone who doesn't know you.
Hi, I'm me, Nick Garner, and I'm founder of Stamp Duty Advice Bureau. There are 15 of us in the business now, and we specialize in stamp duty. We're getting into land and building tax, Scottish revenue tax, and land transaction tax matters with Wales, Welsh Revenue Authority. But anyway, we are a one-trick pony, as it were, which is it's land tax, stamp duty, and so on. And our main agenda is to help people understand the topic. So I've written 2 books on the topic, a monster book, which is in total over 1,000 pages. It's too long. But anyway, I've also written a shorter book, which is essentially a summary guide to the essentials of stamp duty, and it just gives you the very basics. But anyway, the way we make our income as a business is through advice and reclaims. And the biggest block of, if you think about overpaid stamp duty, I've done some data analysis on this. It's about £1.7 billion in overpaid stamp duty a year that has occurred. And the reason it happens is because conveyancing solicitors say, well, that's a house. You're paying residential rates, dear investor. And there's no real discussion about that. And conveyancing solicitor will also say, well, I'm not a tax expert. Sorry. Go to a tax expert. And then you end up in a kind of roundabout circle. And in the meantime, people end up overpaying. And there's something like 30,000 properties a year where people have overpaid stamp duty due to property condition only. And I'm not talking about misapplied stamp duty reliefs or LTT reliefs or LBTT reliefs, just property condition. So
okay, so just to clarify that, so basically you're saying that 30,000 properties, due to them being of a certain condition, should have not paid stamp duty, or
correct.
should have had a reduction.
Should have paid less, should have paid the correct amount of stamp duty.
So they should have gone from residential being a perfectly fine property that you can move into and there's nothing really wrong with it. And what we're looking at is properties that, although people may be living there, are deemed not appropriate for human habitation. Correct. So therefore should be on a commercial stamp duty rate. Is that correct?
Non-residential stamp duty rate. Sorry, it's all about the detail, but that's why people gravitate to us, because we're fastidious about these things. So commercial, it's not actually a thing. It's non-residential. So the main idea behind this is that I'll just go back one step. So there are something like 600,000 residential properties sold every year. And then within that, there are a segment of higher rate properties subject to higher rate stamp duty. And the vast majority, probably 90% of these, relate to companies buying property. And these are landlords, buy-to-let investors, developers, whoever. And they pay the higher rate stamp duty of 3%. And the way the legislation works is that in the Finance Act 2003, there's a definition of what a dwelling is, and it's not, it's subject to debate. And whenever there's a debate, there's generally, you could say there's a court case in the end. And in this instance, there was a court case with PN Bewley, who is a developer, and HMRC back in 2019. And the question in hand was, if property is habitable, should it be assessed as residential for stamp duty purposes? Because a dwelling is a place you can dwell in. And if you can't dwell in a dwelling, then it's not residential, is it?
Yeah.
So it could be an office, it could be a garage, whatever, but it's certainly not a place to live. And so the objective today is to go into all of this in more detail so that you can objectively understand, was that property that I bought actually a dwelling technically? And remember, we're in the world of tax and law and definitions and so on. Anyway, with the court case, what they found was that the property was not habitable and therefore should not have been assessed as residential for stamp duty purposes. And thus it was non-residential. And non-residential stamp duty rates are lower for property investors who have paid higher rate stamp duty, or if you're an owner occupier and your property was purchased for more than £1 million, then also you've got an economic incentive to reclaim that overpaid stamp duty. And so a lot of this, I guess, or a lot of what we're going to do is just really understand what the parameters are.
Brilliant. And once we go through this, just as a feedback, if anyone's got any questions when we're in the thick of this, especially you might see a property that looks similar to something that you've got, for instance, that you had no idea about. If you're listening live, obviously do make a comment. But if you're not listening live, then also do make a comment and we'll be able to come back to you and let you know, clarify that situation as well. And obviously we'll give you some contact details later on. So yeah, do feel free to ask any questions.
So my mission for today is to make this one of the most useful things you've seen in a long time, if your property was a bit of a wreck when you purchased it. So whenever I'm talking to clients, I go through the usual qualifiers. And the first one is, did you buy it in the last 4 years, if it's England or Northern Ireland? If it's Wales, it's 4 years. And if it's Scotland, it's 5 years. Did you pay higher rate stamp duty? Now, bearing in mind, without digressing too much, we'll concentrate on England, Northern Ireland, but just be aware that in Wales, higher rate stamp duty is 4% of the property value. Scotland, it's 6%. And we are doing some test cases with Wales and Scotland. So we'll see how they go. I'm well, we'll see. I can't say I'm confident or not, but the legislation, the legislation, the acknowledgement of certain court cases as being relevant to understanding the legislation are still applicable. So basically it all shapes up. Anyway, right. So the next thing is 4 years, higher rate. And a very simple question might be, when you bought that property as an investor, could you have rented it out the next day? And if you say no, then we're into the next question, which is, okay, what were the condition issues?
And
So,
also, just a quick clarity on that one.
yes.
There may be people living in there, but it may not be appropriate for them to be living. So, for instance, I'm purchasing a property at the moment, and I've found some things that are very disconcerting about this property, and there are people living in there.
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't rent it out in that condition. So again, just because there is somebody living in there doesn't necessarily, am I correct in saying, doesn't necessarily
Absolutely.
mean that it still constitutes a dwelling?
Yeah, so then you're into Home Fitness for Habitation Act 2018, and the question being, is that a decent home? A home with decent. So they have the decent home standard, and is it a decent home? And actually, this arcs back to this whole business about habitability. So broadly, the arguments. So I'll just quickly take it from the top, as in how it all fits together, and then we talk about property condition. The next thing is, right, so you have the qualifiers, you then have the arguments in which we go to HMRC with, and they are broadly not habitable, as in various condition issues, and we argue PN Bewley versus HMRC, which we talked about, where PN Bewley won that case. Then we talk about HHSRS, which is Housing Health and Safety Rating System. And this is very important because it's used as a frame of reference for the Home Fitness for Habitation Act and also the Decent Home Standard. And essentially, it's a quantifiable approach to risk in the home or to hazardous condition issues that make a property uninhabitable. So, Emma, your property that you're interested in has probably got lots of these kind of issues. And under the Homes Act 2004, Section 20 and 21, the local authority or a local authority has the power to issue what's known as a prohibition notice on a property. So in other words, if it has these condition hazards, it could be legally banned from use as a dwelling. In HMRC guidance, what they say is that if a property, if a local authority had cause to issue a prohibition notice on a property, then HMRC would accept that that is not habitable and thus should be assessed as non-residential. It's only one line in their guidance, but it's been there for 8 years, so it's a keeper, as it were. And this is the foundation of our cases. So what we're arguing is that if a property could have been legally restricted from use, then we would say that's not a habitable property.
Fantastic. So again, just to clarify,
yes.
So what we're saying is you can buy a property. It can be a bit of a state, but you may still have a tenant in there. You then it could be deemed as, hazardous conditions. It doesn't necessarily mean that the building is shut down, but it means at that moment it would be considered a non-dwelling, even though somebody's dwelling in it, non-dwelling, which could reduce your stamp duty.
Yeah, roughly speaking. So take the story with the tenant. Okay, so the tenant is being very nice about it all, and the tenant could contact the local authority and say, please come and inspect my property. There's damp, there's mold, whatever. And the local authority inspector would come around, do an HHSRS inspection, which is basically a hazards inspection. And it's different from a RICS inspection, which is basically a survey to determine overall condition. It's there's a lot of crossover, but one is HHSRS is hazards, RICS level 2 or whatever is general condition. And we use RICS surveys all the time to highlight various condition hazards. And we're going to have a look at some of this a little later on in some real live actual cases that we've done.
When should we look into those, Nick? I think it'd be
in a minute.
I'm chomping at the bit, wanting to see this.
Okay, so I'll just to finalize, just to finish on the arguments and all of that. So the arguments are condition hazards, as in, sorry, dereliction, not habitable, PN Bewley, hazardous condition issues, HHSRS, and thus potential for local authority to issue a prohibition notice on that property at the time of purchase. The third one is if it's a buy-to-let, we argue that under the Homes Fitness for Habitation Act, that property isn't rentable and thus legally restricted from use for its intended use as a rentable property. So in this case, Emma, with that lovely tenant, as long as they're happy and you're keeping them sweet, then they're not going to report you. The local authority isn't going to come around and they're not going to do an inspection and they're not going to issue a prohibition notice. But if you're a landlord and you are renting out substandard property, just remember you're in a high risk situation.
So
anyway,
can I just clarify? So you said
yes.
3 things there. So 1 is a hazardous condition.
Yes.
2 is derelict conditions.
Yeah.
And 3 is whether the home is fit for habitation.
Yeah, so PN Bewley, without going into it too much, but basically PN Bewley's argument was property could never have been used as a home and it had to be demolished, which was the case. They bought it to demolish it. And therefore this idea that could never be repaired in dire condition, that was accepted. But also this other idea that if it's just not habitable, it should not be assessed as residential. There's this other layer which is legally restricted from use, and that breaks down into 2 elements, which is just generally legally restricted from use, prohibition order, and so on. And the other one is can't rent because hazardous condition issues as well. But it's a slightly different argument because what we're saying is its intended use was buy-to-let. Can't be used as a buy-to-let because it's legally restricted from use. But so you got 2 pillars to the legally restricted from use argument, which we use. One final thing to say, and then we're going to get on with property condition hazards and so on. And I will say a lot of it's quite counterintuitive, which you will see. So when we get into that. But the final thing is that if a case is procedurally correct, in other words, you ask for the right, you state the right legislation, you make the right request, you submit the right documents, then HMRC, because they operate a pay now, check later policy, then they are likely to pay, very likely to pay. And then they have 9 months in which to make an inquiry on the property into the case. And then what they look for is justification. And if they see no substantive justification, then what they'll do is they'll make an inquiry, and then you have to go and argue it. Now, the reason people use people like us is because you can, in theory, put it all together. It'll take you a while to do the case. So our typical case is 120 pages long. So it's quite a lot of work. We have a lot of admin people. I think I said 15 of us in the company. So over half are admin people. And but what happens with us is our fees are on the line. So if they claw back, we pay back our fees, and thus we're going to fight it out with HMRC because that's why you have us. We're like an insurance policy. So, right, let's talk about condition hazards. So how am I going to do this? I'm going to just
so I will share the screen. Yeah, you ready?
Right. Yes. Okay. Here we are. All right. So the first thing is we have a system, and we use a lot of Google Sheets because it's quite helpful. And we have.
You able to make that any bigger?
I am. Do you see that? How's that?
Double that size would be better.
Oh, that's going to be big.
Oh yeah, that's better. Go back up to the top, and now we can right. Sort of read it now.
So just to explain roughly what we have here is this is a list of 3,219 condition hazards. What happens is we go through the property and the evidence that we've got, and we have a rating system. So it goes from really serious. So if it's a category 5, that means it's a really serious problem, down to 1, which is just take some note. And category 5 is absolute category 1 hazard under HHSRS guidance. And then category 3 is category 2 hazard. So category 1 is an issue that has immediate that could immediately affect health, safety, or mental well-being of the occupant, whereas category 2 is one that could at some point. So that's roughly how that fits together. Let's have a look at this property. So typical condition issues. I'll just bring this up here. Good old Imgur. And here is a classic. So here we've got rising damp, and we've got a few things wrong with all of this. So the first thing, we often get rather smudgy pictures, but it is what it is. There are two issues here to consider. One is the electrics. So you've got rising damp up here. And I think what's happened here is that they tried to fix the damp issue in the past, which is why you don't see any down here. But it's so bad that it's gone more than a meter high. Anyhow, the rule of thumb here is, would this affect the health, safety, or the mental well-being of the occupant? The answer is yes. You can't live in a damp property. The second thing is we've got these electrics, and let's assume that they are in a damp environment, and water and electricity, bad combination. So already I've got two serious condition issues here. And here's another one. So what have we got here? This is a really bad house.
Is it the same house?
Yeah, it is. It is. So all of these pictures are the same property. And here again, we've got three issues that I can see offhand. Obviously, chronic damp, dangerous electrics because of all the water, the moisture around the place, and rotting skirting boards. And those rotting skirting boards are obviously going to have mold and fungus, and then you're into toxic mold, which is going to mess up your lungs. So a really bad place. Let's see what else. Let's see what other goodness there is in this house. Right. So you probably can't see that, but just plaster cracks and lots of damp. And I think I'm just going through this. So here's an example of. And the reason, by the way, we use Imgur is that we have a templating system, and what it does is we have this massive template, and we pull all the condition issues into the template, and then we manually tidy up the template, add in the case arguments, do all of the admin work. But this just saves a bit of effort and time, which is a good thing. Now, loose slates and so we now have loose slates. So obviously the issue with loose slates are if they fall, if they fall on you, you're going to potentially suffer a catastrophic injury. And there was something here. I'll just close this up because we're getting too many tabs. There was a nice one of a roof. And here it is. So here's a good example of something I see quite frequently, which is
clarify, because obviously it's not as big as perhaps you can see. Is that a hole in the roof?
Yes.
Like, oh, they're brilliant.
It's really smudgy, but it's not a great image, but that's often what we have to deal with. You've got the roof, you've got the rafters, or the roof. I don't know what it's called. There's a word, the technical word.
Truss, isn't it?
Trusses.
Yeah.
Yes. And on these, so this is a picture looking up to the ridge of the roof. And we can see here that there's actually water damage here. So yes, there's a hole in the roof. There's a hole in the underlay or the felt lining, and the water's got in, and there are all sorts of issues here. So that there's a theme, which is things that could hurt your health or cause injury. So I'm just going to click through some more pictures, and these are smaller condition issues, but they all add up. So this one here, for example, there we go. All right, this just cracks. Now, in itself, that's not particularly serious, but when we do the when we consider condition hazards, we treat it a bit like point scoring. So here's a calculator. I'm going to just open all this up, and essentially you would have, say, a point target. So a typical.
Is this something we have access to, or is
yeah? It's
what
on the Stamp Duty website, so you can just stampdutyadvicebureau.co.uk, and then the calculator is here. And what, just because it's all zoomed in, it's the formatting's a bit off. But anyway, here's the sort of thing here. So this is probably like 5 points. It's not a significant issue, but you add up the cracks here, you call that 10 points because it's reasonably serious.
Can I just clarify again, is this, per room that we're looking at this, or is it per property? Because presumably you wouldn't necessarily just have one.
It's per property. So in other words, if take for example, a property and it's got that damp issue. Let's go back to that. Imagine you've got one room in the property, and this one here will do. You've got one room and you have this problem in it. Then you can argue that the whole building is not habitable because it's integral to the building.
So for instance, with that in mind and with the damp, so for instance, with this property that I'm purchasing, it's got a small extension at the back.
Yep.
And I put a screwdriver into the floor, and it's literally like a soup. It was like, it's so damp, and it was quite extraordinary, quite shocking. So that, even though that's probably only, I don't know, 2.5, 3 square meters,
yes,
that is part of the building. So therefore would be a hit in one of those boxes.
Exactly. It's a bit like the analogy would be mixed use. So for example, if you're buying a shop with uppers, let's say 30% of the floor area is shop, and 70% is residential. The whole lot is assessed as non-residential for stamp duty purposes because it's mixed. And so you can argue a similar principle here, which is that even though 2 square meters of the property is in this condition, the fact is the whole property is not habitable, which is a reasonable thing to do because you should have enjoyment of the whole property if that's where you live. Versus, well, there's damp in that room, I'm just going to shutter off that room and enjoy the rest of the house. It doesn't really work like that. So yes, if it's in one patch, it's relevant. So let's just have a look at some others here. And bathroom, classic. So the issue here, of course, and if you notice, we're relying heavily on surveys, and these are really helpful because a surveyor is a third-party professional that works independently of it. Obviously, you pay the professional, but they're just going to objectively state the truth, as it were. And therefore, a survey is an incredibly valuable thing to have when arguing your case around property condition. Good photography is too. So
that was black mold.
Yes. So the surveyor says there's mold, and obviously black mold is a really serious matter. So here we are a bathroom, obviously, and you can see on the ceiling, there's mold. Now, in itself, that's not especially serious, you might argue, but the reality is that under HHSRS guidance, black mold is toxic. Black mold is a category 1 hazard. If there's a category 1 hazard, theoretically, the local authority could shut down the property and issue a prohibition notice and say you can't live there, or you can't live in part of the property or whatever. And then that arcs back to this whole point about the HMRC guidance on the matter.
So does it take just one category 1? Or
yes, so
you can either have a whole host of sort of smaller issues. So like you mentioned, you know, a small crack might be 5 points, and you may have a whole host of other things which could in total reach the required level, or
yes.
you could have just like one very serious category 1 hazard.
Yes, I think it's a bit like a person who presents with a heart condition, or congestive heart failure or something horrible. That's just one issue of many. And so with a house with condition hazards, there will always be more than one issue. But you could say that if you have something like dangerous electrics, for example, a failed electric safety test, you've got a hazardous property, because obviously electricity can kill you if it goes through you instead of the device.
Serious issue, yeah.
so yeah, it could be, if you're thinking about your own property that you purchased in the last 4 years, that you paid higher rate stamp duty, and you're thinking, what were the big hazards back then? Well, yeah, there are these blockbuster hazards, which are going to be what we've seen: damp, mold, etc. Dangerous electrics is classic. But here's something a bit more subtle. So this one is, I'll just zoom in here a little bit. Right. Sorry, I'm just trying to, I don't know if you can see that. Okay. See if I can open this in a new tab. If I can, I can zoom right. Okay, here we go. All right. What's special about this picture, Emma?
Oh, somebody's constantly calling me for a second. So I can see we've got a loose tile.
Yep. Where's that loose tile?
Yes.
Yeah. So you got yourself a loose tile at the front. So okay, I'll just explain the context of this. Right, you got a loose tile. Fine. So what? Well, the issue is that if you were poking around in the front garden, chatting to your neighbor by the wall or whatever, and that thing came loose, that's a small guillotine. So that's quite an issue.
Yeah.
Okay, next. And the idea being that these issues, they accumulate. And here's another one. Moisture. And you can see here that I don't know if you can see here, but the reading is in the red, and there's quite a lot of moisture. You can actually see the damage on the wall. Yeah. Again, it's another issue. So when we have the calculator on the website, which you might want to play with, whatever, you can see that there are all of the CSS. Dear, I need to write. I don't know what's going on there. Okay. Anyway, the point being that you could say mold, damp, toxic mold, for example, 100 points. You've got yourself a case. So let's say 100 points is a case. Damp, if you've only got a small amount, how much would you score that? How much more of that damp would you need to really argue that this property isn't habitable? So in this case, not that much damp, but there is damp. So let's say there's more than this in the house. So I would give this 30 points, for example. So let's say we got 2 or 3 other points where there's damp. It's not turned into mold. It's just a kind of a lurking issue that people can kind of live around. But damp doesn't occur in one spot. It tends to be fairly pervasive. So therefore, you might argue that.
So generally, you would anticipate, wouldn't you, that damp, let's say it's in the basement or on the ground floor, it would generally be, probably if it's on one wall, it would be the whole side of that house, or even the whole of that basement, so to speak.
Yeah. And so do you remember earlier I said a good test is, could you have rented that property out? I think most investors are knowledgeable enough on condition to know what safe looks like, what reasonable, what habitable looks like. Now, here's another example of something. Boiler installed. In itself, that's not a big deal, but it's it's not enclosed, and arguably if the thing went wrong, then you've got yourself a higher risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, we're not saying that that's an especially serious issue. We're just saying be aware of it. And that's reasonable because you should be. And then we've got other information. I'm just having a look. So these have a lot of words and not that many pictures. Let's find another one where we have more pictures and less words, hopefully. So one of my team, Martin, in fact, put this together for me. He just picked a few random ones for me. Okay, this is an interesting example. Technically, there's a kitchen.
Yeah.
And let's just make this extra big so that we can zoom in, and I'll do this. Right, here we go. Yeah, technically that's a kitchen. But the question is that a kitchen you could use? Like, would a reasonable person use that? Now, in law, there's this idea, it's not legislated, but there's this understanding of what's known as a reasonable person. A reasonable person is just your average. But
and
the question is, yes,
I would say having twin 18-year-old boys, I think they would not be considered reasonable people when you see them leaving my kitchen at the end of the time. So,
well, by a different measure, I read a case argument about this, like just discussion in a particular case, and it was P. and Bewley, and they were just talking about, would a reasonable person live there, and an unreasonable person who might be an 18-year-old twin, or a vagrant, or somebody like that who's under difficult circumstances, they could live here, but your average person couldn't. So then the point being that we would argue that there is general property neglect, and that there are inadequate facilities for preparing food, which I think you could say there, which I think you could argue, because a reasonable person wouldn't have a kitchen like this, and it's inadequate for food preparation, and therefore it falls under HHSRS guidance. So,
and this is as it is now, yeah? So it isn't, obviously you could give it a clean up, you could put in new appliances, all of those things, but it's what it is right now.
Yes. And exactly, the whole foundation
it's whether you can do it tomorrow, whether you can rent that out tomorrow is the
it's the condition at the very moment you've purchased the property. Okay. And so here's some general guidance, which I'm just going to find some pictures, because pictures are nice. And there's a very good document, which I think this one, yes. It's fairly straightforward, the parameters of this, and other parameters are, so I'll just quickly rattle through this because I think it might be helpful, and then what we can do is perhaps look at some properties on the market at the moment, and then we can help you identify those.
So which, all right. What is this?
This is a local authority guide to HHSRS guidance. So in other words, housing health and safety rating system. And they're just
something, sorry, that we would find in our own local authority?
Well, different local authorities have their own guidance, or many do, but it's UK-wide legislation. So there is a set standard, and so these people have done this document to help explain it, but there are numerous other documents, but they all follow the guidance from HMRC and or government guidance on how to interpret the legislation. So the legislation itself isn't particularly verbose, but there's loads and loads of guidance on it. So does that answer the question?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. Right. We talked about damp. Excess cold is a good example where, for example, let's say that boiler that you bought that property, the boiler didn't work. Excess cold. actually a really serious issue, and definitely category 1. So busted boiler or old gas-fired central heat, old gas-fired central heating, like out of not fit for use, really, not safe, not fit for use, or those old gas heaters that you got in the 60s and 70s, which you occasionally see in property. Excess heat is a difficult one to argue, really, in this country, so we tend not to talk about that. Asbestos is more widespread issue than many might think. So, you know, those textured ceiling finishes you got in the up to the mid 80s, Artex finish. These textured, unpleasant text. Sorry if you like them. I dislike them. But this kind of thing here.
Yeah.
Any property pre 1985 is likely to have asbestos in the Artex. To don't know why they did it, but that's what they did, and therefore we often argue asbestos in the ceiling finishes. We just say it's a category 2 hazard. So in other words, it's just be aware of it. Don't disturb it. Biocides are an interesting one. If you've got persistent mold and so on, then you got this, you're killing off the mold, but you got all the biocides. And we tend not to refer to that. Another classic is carbon monoxide risk. So we looked at that, the boiler that wasn't enclosed, or no carbon monoxide alarms in the property. Then we have lead paint, not that common, but lead piping, more common than one might think, and especially so for unmodernized terraced houses in the north of England or even in the south, but typically they'll be modernized by now. Radiation, that's a rather unusual one, but radon gas, if a property is located in a place where there's a lot of general background radiation, it's a problem. But then the question is, well, if you knew there was radiation, why did you buy the property?
Would that be something like I'm just thinking of a couple of properties where there's a pylon right next to the property?
Yeah. So high voltage electricity. And yes, I think you could argue that as well. It's not a substantial argument, but I've just kind of dipped into a slight landmine, which is the argument that, well, why did you buy the property if you knew it had all these condition issues? Well, the reality is that doesn't factor into the argument. You just bought the property. It's not why did you buy it. And this is a general principle with all of this stuff, which is it's just what were the facts, not the supposition, not the history, not the future, just what was going on at that moment you purchased. All right. Crowding a space is an interesting one as well. Clutter. So sometimes we see properties which are just full of junk, and arguably we could say that that's a problem. And entry by this is one we come up with a lot. Front door, back door, old wooden, slight bit of rot, that kind of thing. Then we would cite that. Lighting, yes, very often just unmodernized, bad lighting. We would also cite that. Noise, not so much. And then again, on the idea, quite a lot of properties just have a lot of trash. Garden is a mess, that kind of thing. There's rubbish strewn everywhere, and also pictures of mouse and rat poo around the place. Then we're going to talk about this. Food safety, yes. So we looked at that kitchen, inadequate facilities, and arguably doesn't lend itself to decent food safety. So we would argue that. The next one is bathrooms in inadequate state, or unmodernized bathrooms, not fit for purpose. Again, so you can see that there are an awful lot of things here which are kind of counterintuitive, but technically, it's. I'll just show you. the language here, because this will help. And oh, there's our website. We rank. That's nice. And where is it? Yes. I don't want to get too distracted from this. I'll dig this out in a minute, but we'll carry on just rattling through this. Water supply, those lead pipes. And if you have lead pipes, then you have inadequate clean water supply, for instance, or damaged drains is another one, or blocked sinks, or blocked lavatories, and so on. This, not really, but we see a lot of stuff for falls on level surfaces is an interesting one. So very often there are steps outside a front house and there's no railing, and that's dangerous. Or there are trip hazards around the property. So a good example is a worn carpet with shredded worn carpet, basically with holes in it, and or a parquet floor with bits missing from it. Again, all fall hazards, and those things can injure you immediately, and therefore they are a category 1 hazard. Stairs, a very typical example is 1970s staircases with the this kind of thing here. I'll just make it bigger so you can see it. These staircases don't meet modern building regulations, and I'll just put that in a new image so that I'll make it nice and big. Here we are. Right. It is 100 millimeters, but a lot of the older ones are more than 100 mils, and they're long like this. And so you've got a child messing around here, sticks his head in, loses footing, and that's just a breakneck situation. Horrible and dangerous. So we would definitely flag up those kind of issues where there's risks on stairs. And falls. So this is another one where, for example, let's say you've got a window which can be fully opened on, say, first floor, and you could just tumble out the window. It's a risk. Hazards, we've talked about that. That's very self-evident. And fire risk is another interesting one. So what we see a lot are polystyrene tiles ceiling. This is classic for here we are. I'll just open this one, and this is, yeah, we see this a lot. So 19 properties that were last renovated in the 70s, very often they have these polystyrene tiles, and they are a really serious fire hazard. So that's an immediate red flag for us, and we say category 1, because it is. If that goes on fire, that's going to give you a bad outcome. And then collision and entrapment is things like badly laid out. It's quite a difficult one, but for example, doors not closing properly, or or bad layout in property, that kind of thing. We tend not to refer to that very often. Explosions are pretty self-evident, but good example of that is that old gas fire that is in that 1960s house. That's there to explode on you. And then just here, for example, doors that don't open properly and so on. This is a big one, and this is the last one. And we talked about that earlier. Falling slates are a good one, or walls that have step cracks in them and are likely to collapse, or anything that is going to fall and hurt you badly. That's what one has to watch out for. So the other thing that I just want to quickly talk about is the guidance, because I think if you understand the guidance in the context of all this HHSRS stuff, then you will feel emboldened, I hope, because the law is on your side. So the guidance The way this works is that obviously HMRC are very clear about their guidance in most cases. And in this case, what they say down here is this. And I'm just going to go kind of word for word. Well, I talked about it earlier, but now just to circle back. So there are hazards. We've seen lots of those. And a local authority would cause a local authority. Now, this is the key word, cause. It's not saying that a local authority would. But imagine you've got a house like some of the properties we've seen. Would a local authority issue a prohibition notice on that property because of the condition hazards present? Yes, they would. They wouldn't want to, but technically they could. And so if you have those issues, then you've got hazards present that would cause a local authority to issue a prohibition notice restricting use of the property. Fact. So that's why when you work through the lens of condition hazards, as opposed to general condition of property or whatever, then you're working within HMRC guidance. Does that help, Emma?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite tremendous. I was just thinking of a sort of a few other examples. So what I've seen is we've gone through a huge number of examples,
Yep.
and a lot of them, in fairness, as a property investor, especially a property investor who's looking to add value once they've purchased a property, these are things that we just see on a daily basis. So, you know, this is really very, very interesting. And I should imagine that, you know, a lot of people have varying ways that you can sort of reduce or negate stamp duty. But these are, you know, we're kind of always led to believe that, you know, not being habitable was something really, really like, you know, the bathroom ripped out, the kitchen ripped out, and, you know, a big hole in the roof. Whereas what we're saying here is, you know, obviously there are some buildings that are very extreme, but actually there can be some buildings that are rented out in an okay condition, but actually there's a few bits that when you look much deeper are really, you know, a major could potentially be a major hazard.
Yeah. So I think above all, this isn't about saving stamp duty. This is about the law giving you, this is about whether you overpaid stamp duty because you have a legitimate argument to say this property wasn't habitable at time of purchase. If you reduce your stamp duty liability, well done you, that's fine. But actually the essence of everything is to be correct about things. And so that's why when you're considering all this kind of stuff, it's just think about those condition hazards. So I'll take this property. This is a really good example of a typical £130,000 potential buy to let. And the first thing I would say, just bearing in mind, estate agency pictures always look nicer, don't they, than the reality?
Essentially, yes.
So my guess is that there are probably some roof issues here. There is general property neglect, obviously. I think there's some damp down there. It's not that easy to see, but I'll just show you. So this is the kind of stuff. So if you're thinking, if you've done your homework and you understand the legislation and you understand the property conditions that are present that could cause problems, then you will know what you're walking into by watching videos like this. And here I can see some damp issues down in that corner, which makes sense because that's usually where they occur. So the plaster is just not doing great down there. It's a bit damaged. The other thing I would say about this, as it appears, it's not perfect, but there's some more damp lurking there probably. And what I'm looking for are things like, for example, there's a plain door. That's not a fire door, I expect. And what else have I got? There was a couple of things that stood out to me on this one. So there's nothing absolutely stand out on this. That's right. in the loft, you've got some interesting issues. So obviously there's little signs of damp and what have you, but it's the staircase. This is a real hazard, and it so does not meet building regs. And also there's damp here. I don't see damp on the ceiling. There's also issues here, and that's probably symptomatic of damp in water ingress in the kitchen as well. But the agent isn't showing you that for various reasons. So yeah, this is the kind of property where odds are it's probably claimable once you paid the stamp duty. And the other thing just to say on this, should we can finish with screen share, can't we? And then kind of,
yeah,
how do we get back to you and me?
Yeah, I shall do that.
So I'll just go there. Right. To recap on the main things. Firstly, don't do abusive cases because it's not on and you'll get in trouble. If you have a case that has merit, well, you should know it by now because you've seen all these condition issues. Then yes, the law is on your side. Guidance is relatively clear, not abundantly
clear. Can I just
clear.
clarify that when you say don't do abusive cases? So, i.e., the facts are the facts. It either is hazardous or it is not. There's no point in making it up, so to speak.
So let's take that cottage, that little terraced house. So there's nothing really serious going on with the real estate, with the estate agent pictures, but I'm sure with a bit of poking around, you would find a lot more to talk about. So imagine you did a case based on that. I think it's hard to argue. The place needs renovation, needs upgrading, but it's not in dire condition. It's just a modest house in well-worn condition. And if you said, oh, there's a damp patch in that tiny little corner there, and that's the justification for my case, well, yeah, the HMRC will pay that because they operate on a pay now, check later basis. And because they're under-resourced, they may not check and you may get away with it. But fundamentally, it's an abusive case. And just don't do that kind of thing, please. So you got that. But yeah, overall, as I said, there are probably about 30,000 of these claimable properties surfacing every year. And I think the other big thing is people listen to, or when they do a search for stamp duty reclaims, they see a lot of very negative commentary on the topic. And as somebody who's familiar with digital public relations, I know as a fact that it's designed to impart a certain message. But actually, once you work your way through all of the fear, uncertainty, doubt, and you look at the legislation, look at the case law, look at what's actually going on, not the hearsay, then you realize the law is on your side if you have an uninhabitable property at time of purchase.
So just to clarify once more, you talk about reclaim all the time.
Yes.
So are you suggesting that if you have a property that you're just purchasing,
yep,
that it's better to pay the stamp duty and then reclaim than the other way, than to upfront state that it's uninhabitable or has these hazards?
If you avoid paying tax, that's kind of tax avoidance. And the issue with tax avoidance as a general topic is the legislation allows for a very open-ended situation with HMRC. In other words, they can cook up all sorts of allegations and trouble if you're avoiding tax. The question is whether this kind of merits, this would merit this level of interest from HMRC. There, arguably, it's better just to pay the stamp duty because then you show good faith. I've paid it. Now I want this back because a mistake occurred and I want to reclaim, I want to get that stamp duty back. and here's why. But if you are less risk averse, then as some property developers are, property people are, and so on, then you could say to your conveyancing solicitor, place is a wreck, here's why, and self-assess as non-residential, please. And they'll fight about it. And then as long as you're really explicit and there's a paper trail on the thing saying, look, I told you to do this, please do it, then they aren't in line for any question of bad practice. You know, that they wouldn't be subject to.
And that kind of, I suppose, goes back to when you talked about paperwork, you talked about those 3 different things to look out for, 3 different levels. And as long as you have, you know, the surveys, the pictures, all of those kind of things, then you could potentially do your self-assessment. But you feel overall it's safer because that could be construed as avoiding tax. But if you pay it and then claim it back, then that looks much better. And is there a time scale on this?
Right. So just caveat to this is, if I go to you and say, look, you should do this, and then lots of people do it, then I'm promoting tax avoidance. And I don't do that because I pay the correct tax, full stop. It's higher risk and you have to be ready for a fight. And if you are, that's fine. In situations where we're talking quite substantial amounts of money, then there's the resource to hire a tax barrister and to go and fight it out in the first tier tax tribunal. But that's a totally different level to just some £130,000 semi-dilapidated buy-to-let somewhere. And if you just want a quiet life and essentially work by the well-understood rules, pay, reclaim. If you're punchy, if you've done your homework and you're streetwise on these things, then self-assess as non-residential. Make sure you get an HHSRS inspection done so that you've got evidence. Make sure that you've got your case argument sorted out and you're ready to go. And then if they inquire, they've got 9 months in which to do so. After 9 months, you're basically clear. But remember, tax avoidance has, I think it's 6 years that they can inquire within 6 years. And for widespread abuse of tax avoidance, I think it's even up to 20. But we're not talking about that. It's a stamp duty matter. It's typically 9 months. That's that.
But let's say we purchased, we paid the stamp duty, you've got everything ready, you know, because obviously you've just bought the property, so you've got all the pictures, they're all fresh. Do you immediately do it, or is there
yeah.
So you can immediately do it, and how quickly can you get it back? So obviously for us as property investors, there's some cash flow things. And obviously if you've paid a big chunk of stamp duty, you clearly have bought a property that needs a lot of work doing.
Yes.
Can we rely on that money? As you've said, it's returned.
Yeah, well, now you're drifting into an interesting one, which is that if you don't do your budgeting right and you don't assume, if you're relying on that stamp duty money for some reason, well, you're in the wrong kind of place with all of this. So really, if you're going to do it right, you get your reclaim, you put the money on ice for 9 months, and once that's over, 9 months from the date of the reclaim, by the way, once it's over, and you can do what you like with that money. It's for you really to put all the the dots together, as it were. I've done my best to do paint by numbers. The bottom line is you do what's within the law. You follow your rights within the law, and now you've seen how to do it. And it's quite helpful sometimes to have people like us, me and Emma, to help decode this for you.
Amazing. Well, look, we are just over time, but this has been really tremendous. It's been very, certainly very eye-opening for myself at this property that I'm purchasing, and also thinking about others as well. So yeah, it's tremendously interesting. So Just as a reminder, if people are interested in this, they can obviously contact me and yourself. What is the best course of action?
Right. If you're, I suppose, easiest is to, if you want to talk to somebody that's accessible, because I'm not, especially because I'm very busy these days, then easiest is go talk to Emma. She knows her way around this stuff. And if she thinks you got a viable reclaim or whatever, then it just helps all of us, because then it's all a bit more pre-processed, and that would help. So probably, yeah, talk to you, Emma. Sorry to say. Go to the website, do all of that. But if you're here because you like Emma and you follow her, and I like her and I follow her, and she does know what she's talking about. So try that. If it's a really complex question or whatever, then maybe try me. There we are.
Fantastic. So just a reminder, your website, all of those details as well.
Yes, Stamp Duty Advice Bureau. Advice Bureau, like citizens' advice, like we're here to help. There's so much information on the website. We are, I've actually written 2 books on stamp duty. One is just too big. It's about 1,000 pages. It's a bit embarrassing, really, but it's been a mission. And the reason I've done all this, by the way, is to understand the topic in detail, because the more I understand it, the more good outcomes occur. So got that, and then I've just written the essential land tax guide, which is just an abbreviated version of the big book. It's about 160 pages, and it just goes through the essentials. It'll give you general bearings. So these books are going to be published fairly shortly, and excerpts are already going on the website. So the Stamp Duty Advice Bureau have got Veronica putting all that stuff up on the site. So I want to open source this as much as I can.
Amazing. Well, Nick, that has been a tremendous session. Really appreciate that. So, guys, if anyone has missed the first interview that I did with Nick, where we really went into absolute detail around the whole background of stamp duty and real intricate details, then please go and listen to that one. And then this one, as you can see, has been a very practical look at what exactly it is when you go into a property and you look at a wall and there's maybe damp, there's maybe cracks, there's maybe various issues. So it's been really, really great for me. I've really, really enjoyed it. So thank you so much, Nick. Really appreciate that. And both of us will be shortening this off as well, so we can have some sound bites. And then also, I always forget to say this, but I've remembered now, if you've enjoyed the content, then please do subscribe. I do regular content weekly, generally outside of school holidays. So please do subscribe so you keep up to date with everything that I do. So again, thank you so much, Nick. And look forward to catching up.